in the U.S., murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women, which is pretty shocking. And from your perspective, I mean, this is a very broad question, but why do you think that they are so often the target of violence?
So Indigenous women are targeted specifically as victims of human trafficking. A lot of reservations, we are in rural, remote areas. And unfortunately, due to generational trauma and historical discrimination, a lot of Native peoples are living in poverty. We are one of the most impoverished demographics in the nation. And that stems from being removed from our traditional lands, to being forcibly sterilized, to being discriminated in the workplace environment. And so communities that are struggling to connect with their culture, or communities that are struggling to provide and put food on the table or get access to education, they are targeted as victims of human trafficking. And unfortunately, perpetrators begin to notice these loopholes between the federal, state, and tribal jurisdiction. And it adds to a community that is rich in targets for human trafficking. There's also high rates of domestic violence in relationships with Native communities, especially for non-Native people who are in the relationships who are aware of the loophole.
Would you say that the rates of domestic violence are higher than a non-tribal environment, like statistically higher than, unfortunately to say, average rates of domestic violence?
Yes.
Interesting.
And that actually applies to both Indigenous women and Indigenous men. Both experience high rates of domestic violence.
Okay. That's a statistic I was not aware of. What have you seen in your own experience to be, I mean, there's always going to be predators in the world. I think we can agree upon that. And there's things that we can do to try to prevent predatory acts. The legal system hopefully does its job. There's investigations, catching these people hopefully before they commit their crime. But if they do, doing something about that. That's one aspect. Mm-hmm. What have you seen to be the most effective from the tribe or tribes inside of themselves? Because you can't control, I mean, to a degree, obviously you can, try to prevent the predator from getting access, but there's an aspect of it you can focus on the things that you can control yourself. What have you seen to be the most effective tools at combating these statistics, whether it's domestic violence, human trafficking, assault against women, physical or sexual? Have you seen things internally that have made a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I think prevention is the biggest thing that tribes are focusing on now, and that's empowering people through education. Unfortunately, a lot of our youth who are targeted as victims of human trafficking have never been introduced to what does grooming look like, right? Like, what are the warning signs of human trafficking, and what makes them vulnerable to human trafficking? So things like this, unfortunately, a lot of Native youth just haven't been exposed to. And it's like this lack of awareness that makes Indigenous people a target. And so education and community building within the tribes has been especially powerful. Even where I'm going to work, Mother Nation runs a missing and murdered Indigenous girls prevention group. So every Sunday, the girls all get together and they talk over, like, what does consent mean? What is grooming? How do we have healthy relationships with ourselves and others? And also creating that healthy connection to culture, because there are certain cultural values and traditional values for each tribe that encourage some form of like physical, emotional, spiritual, and social health. And so when these needs are not being met, because unfortunately they're just not emphasized in Western medicine, like this holistic care.
What are you talking about? We got a pill for everything.
Yeah. It's just $1,000. You got it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, an insurance might cover it. And if that pill doesn't work, we got 3 other ones that can deal with the side effects. It's totally fine.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And so a big part of it is I even go into schools and I teach some of the students about like the holistic care and like how do you care for yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And it's this like strengthened connection to culture, to values, to knowledge that can be very protective factors. However, there's only so much we can be done with the inside. I do think of a woman from the Yakama Nation, which is one of my tribes, who was murdered here in Seattle, and her body was found less than a mile away from my house. And she was a social worker, and she was doing um, a wellness check. She was specifically a housing crisis social worker,
Mm-hmm.
and she was murdered while doing her job. And she was connected to her culture and community. She was serving the public. And there are just some things that like we fully cannot control. And that could easily be me. I'm a social worker and I'm connected to my community and I'm connected to my culture, but there's only so much my tribe can do to protect me. We're only half of the equation.
Do you have any sense of, and specifically narrowing it down to either violence, sexual assault, or missing Indigenous women, do you have any sense of where I don't even necessarily know how to describe it because I've never really had a deep conversation about this, where the origin of the event generally occurs? Does it more often occur when the women leave the tribal land, or is it a 50-50 of it, maybe an event originates on tribal land, but then it seems like the bodies are oftentimes not found on the tribal land, especially if obviously the act of violence occurs somewhere else. Do you have any sense of kind of I guess it would be the framework for how that is occurring?
Yeah. So it is very unique. I think the way that Indigenous women are victimized is very systemic. So on the one hand, you have women who are on the reservation. That was me at one point. And traffickers will come to these communities and find vulnerable people and traffic them, often with the use of substance abuse as well. A person who is struggling with substance use disorder is more likely to be targeted for human trafficking because they are controlled by the substance.
You get leverage. Yeah.
So that's one case that's happening both on the reservation and in the cities. 70% of Indigenous people do live in urban settings. So while the majority of the crimes are happening in the cities or in rural areas outside of the reservation, the reason why I do talk about the reservation so much is because they are in such a unique context, because there are traffickers coming from outside into the reservation because they know that's where the people are. And then here in the city, I would say Indigenous women are not quite targeted in the same way. However, there are still people with awareness of that loophole. And that's kind of where we get cases like the Yakama social worker here who was murdered. But they are both very unique contexts and are similar to finding like the vulnerabilities for Native women and men and boys as well in each unique context.